Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I certainly wish I could have joined you all in Bonn and maybe for a drink afterwards, but someday soon we'll be able to do that, I sure hope. And thank you, Jean Horber, for orchestrating the logistics of today. So my talk comes from the book that Stefan just mentioned, Slave Law and the Politics of Resistance, that came out a couple years ago. And it's really a distillation of the 6th chapter, I believe. The last generation of the 18th century witnessed bewildering events in the politics of slavery that seemed to promise the unraveling of a world. Like a 1-2 punch, the emergence of radical abolitionism in the 1780s and the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s forced slaveholders to find their balance and deflect unprecedented threats from above and below that would test their political skills in moments of great weakness. In May of 1787, in Great Britain and in the United States, the struggle over Atlantic slavery took on a new dimension as white men with power and anti-slavery views began to act toward the abolition of racial slavery. Among the delegates of the new American states who traveled to Philadelphia to frame a new central government were men of anti-slavery convictions who wanted racial slavery to wither and die. In London, on the 22nd of that month, 12 men met in a printer's shop to form the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. 2 weeks later, William Wilberforce, one of their number and member of Parliament for Hull, made his first formal proposals to consider the abolition of the slave trade with Africa. The struggle over slavery in the highest seats of power had begun. Political compromise trumped moral principle in 1787, and slaveholders retained great power. But just 4 years later, in August of 1791, on the central plain of French Saint-Domingue, began the World Historic Slave Rebellion that extinguished one class of slaveholders and posed an existential threat to all the rest. African-born slaves and their descendants in Saint-Domingue exploited the revolutionary divide in France and its empire and struck for their own liberation. Their actions inspired enslaved peoples throughout the Atlantic world. Rebels developed conspiracies, some led insurrections, and while none of these militant actions sustained the violent intensity of the Haitian Revolution, slave violence in the wake of Haiti showed how the liberating ethos of the age inspired men and women of every status and origin. The era of the Haitian Revolution saw a transformation in the politics of Atlantic slavery. The resistance of slaves had always challenged the power of the planters, but now resistance was reinforced by abolitionist agitation, deepening the ancient struggle between the masters and the slaves. The American Revolution has divided the Anglo-Atlantic world of slavery, but in their respective political milieus, Jamaica and South Carolina slaveholders had much in common. They championed the defense of slavery against abolitionist pressure, and they crushed the resistance of their slaves. Both planter classes developed new commodities, coffee and cotton, which promised a new era of wealth and slavery at the dawn of the 19th century. In response to abolitionism and the Haitian Revolution, the slaveholders retrenched. And I should say right now, briefly, that this comes from a larger comparative history of Jamaica and South Carolina, okay, which begins in the late 17th century and goes all the way into in the mid 1830s. Okay, and we can talk about that chronology in the question and answer more if you wish. Historians date the emergence of British abolitionism to the publication of James Ramsay's essay on the treatment and conversion of slaves in 1784. A longtime resident of St. Kitts, Ramsay advanced a trenchant critique of Caribbean slavery centered on a comparison of the slave codes, the laws, of the French and British West Indies. It was savvy politics to contrast British slaveholders unfavorably with Britain's archenemy, and it allowed Ramsay to demonstrate the particular barbarity of British West Indian slavery. He highlighted the various protections for slaves embedded in the French Code Noir that were absent from the British West Indian codes. The Code Noir required French slaveholders to provide allowances of food and clothing, and it prohibited masters from mutilating their slaves. In contrast, Ramsay lamented, not a single law in the British West Indies secured the least humane treatment for England's slaves. English slaves went naked and hungry, and a slave in Britain's sugar islands could be hacked to pieces with a cutlass for stealing a piece of cane. Not a clause in the British colonial laws offered the slightest protection. We need not accept Ramsay's idealistic view of French Caribbean slavery, and in fact, we shouldn't. But we need to understand the potency of his argument. Ramsay inspired 9 pro-slavery responses and pamphlets, and the legal foundation of his argument structured the debate over slavery in the British Empire. Thomas Clarkson, for example, noted that Britain's slaves had no laws to protect them, and he singled out Jamaica as especially brutal. Clarkson referenced several clauses of Jamaica's Slave Act of 1696, which was still in effect in 1785. Whites could legally kill a slave for striking a white person, or even imagining the death of a white person. Whites could kill any slave who refused to submit to punishment. Even if a white person murdered a black person, the white could not be punished until he or she did this twice. Clarkson did not exaggerate when he made such accusations. Jamaican slaveholders did not respond to the publication of Ramsay's essay in 1784. The 9 pro-slavery defenses had all come from the Eastern Caribbean. While the Jamaicans saw Ramsay as beneath contempt. But when William Wilberforce submitted his proposals to abolish the slave trade to the House of Commons in May 1787, Jamaicans led the response. British abolitionists followed Wilberforce's proposals with more than 100 anti-slavery petitions to Parliament, and Jamaicans on both sides of the Atlantic, absentees and those in the island, responded with complementary strategies that would ultimately blunt the abolitionist assault. Stephen Fuller, agent to Parliament for the Jamaica House of Assembly, organized the pro-slavery defense in London, while the Assembly took important measures in Jamaica. Fuller came from an old Jamaican planting family, and he led the Society of West India Merchants and Planters, a lobbying organization based in London. Jamaican absentees were the most active members of this society, and during the struggle over the slave trade, Fuller served as the principal organizer. He planned a series of meetings to coordinate the response to the abolitionists, but he also deployed the fear of violence. In January 1788, just 2 weeks before the Board of Trade began its hearings on the African slave trade, Fuller penned a terrifying letter to Lord Hawkesbury, president of the board. Fuller warned of a slave rebellion if the abolitionists were to continue their agitation. For every 3 white men in Jamaica, there were 50 black slaves, Fuller warned. The domestic slaves, he explained, read all the public prints and instantly communicate any intelligence respecting themselves to their fellow slaves employed in the field. If the slaves learned of their friends in England raising large sums of money on their behalf, they might strike while the iron is hot and liberate themselves. Active measures to defend the slave system were also underway in Jamaica. The House of Assembly began to build a case that the abolitionists were misinformed activists who libeled honorable British subjects whose commerce was of great value to the empire. The Jamaica Assembly took the first step in October 1787 when it met to reconsider its slave code. Ramsey and Clarkson had paid particular attention to these laws, which had clearly become a liability. The Assembly did its work quickly, passing a new code, a new comprehensive code, just 2 months later, that came to be known as the Consolidated Act. The first several clauses appealed to the humanity of the planters. They required the provision of adequate land for their slaves' provision grounds, care for slaves who were old or sick, and proper and sufficient clothing for all slaves. The new laws prohibited the mutilation of slaves and proscribed death for any person convicted of murdering a slave. Stephen Fuller had the new law printed as a pamphlet and added some curious changes to the text that suggest their intent as propaganda. On the title page for the entire Consolidated Act, Fuller presented the new laws as the essential regulations of the Jamaica Code Noir, suggesting that the new laws followed the more humane regulations of the French. And in an abstract of the new law, which was printed in one page, the author added a clause guaranteeing religious instruction to the slaves, which did not appear in the actual law. In an almost point-by-point fashion, the Assembly had passed new laws to undermine the charges of cruelty advanced by the abolitionists. The new slave laws appeared alongside a series of commentaries by prominent Jamaicans that offered a progressive narrative to frame West Indian slavery. Pamphlets by the absentees Gilbert Franklin and Brian Edwards argued that the abolitionists based their portrayal of Jamaican society on histories and laws that reflected a bygone era, not their own time. Jamaica's planters might have been an unpolished, uncivilized race in the 17th century, but the rising generation of West Indians had been nursed in the bosom of peace. They had refined manners and humane sentiments. Slave rebellions were no longer a threat to the growth due to the growth in the Creole slave population and the amelioration of the laws. Franklin even predicted the gradual abolition of slavery through increased manumissions by benevolent planters. The Board of Trade hearings on the slave trade lasted 2 years and brought much evidence to light of the abuses that pervaded the entire system. But led by the Jamaicans, West Indian slaveholders had defended themselves very well. Wilberforce brought motions to abolish the slave trade twice, in 1791 and 1792, and both times they were defeated. After 8 years of agitation, the only legislative accomplishment the abolitionists could show was the passage in the Commons of a toothless resolution to consider the abolition of the slave trade at some undetermined point in the future. And the House of Lords rejected that. Slaveholders had met their opponents in the court of public opinion and in the legislatures, and they had soundly defeated them. During the same months that saw the beginnings of British abolitionism, delegates from the 13 newly independent states of North America met in Philadelphia to consider the establishment of a more powerful central government for the United States. South Carolina sent one of the most prestigious delegations, 4 men who had all served during the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. Each man possessed a sizable fortune in land and slaves, and no one had a better understanding of the political economy of slavery protected by the American Revolution. In Philadelphia, the South Carolina delegation faced men who had starkly different views on the future of slavery in North America. The northern states had begun to abolish slavery, and many Northerners considered the transatlantic slave trade to be a great evil. Slavery took on a central role in the debates beginning in June 1787, when the delegates took up the question of apportionment in the House of Representatives. A principal tenet of the Republican ideology, shared by most delegates, held that national sovereignty derived from the will of the people. But many delegates, including the South Carolinians, believed that wealth should be the principal consideration when it came to the question of who should govern. To align popular sovereignty with the primacy of wealth required much conciliation, and perhaps inevitably, it required the discussion of slavery. On June 11th, James Wilson of Pennsylvania proposed that the congressional representation from each state be apportioned by the white population added to 3/5 of all other persons, by which he meant black slaves. The 3/5 ratio had been considered during the Revolutionary War to assess the taxation of the states, but it had been rejected in favor of taxing land. Wilson's proposal would shape the very structure of government, but South Carolinians wanted more. Pierce Butler and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, delegates of South Carolina, attacked the proportion as unfair to the slaveholding states. They wanted black slaves to be included equally with whites. For as Butler argued, black slaves were as productive of wealth as free white laborers, and in a government instituted principally for the protection of property, slaves must be included. South Carolina stood alone on this issue. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, for example, stated that his white constituents would revolt at the idea of being considered the equals of slaves. Moreover, to count slaves for the allotment of power to the slaveholding states would encourage the transatlantic slave trade, which Morris considered a violation of human nature. It was the first clear expression of anti-slavery views among the delegates. No one followed Morris at this point in the debates, but a line had been crossed. Debate continued for several more weeks, and in July, the convention formed the Committee of Detail, which would be charged with drafting the many resolutions of the convention into a single document. John Rutledge of South Carolina was made chair of this committee, and not surprisingly, the draft it produced protected slavery and the slave trade. The committee's draft prompted heated debate. Gouverneur Morris moved to revisit the question of representation and delivered an impassioned speech that compared the free regions of New England and Pennsylvania with the slaveholding regions of New York, New Jersey, and the South. How, he asked, could this convention consider slaves in representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? The houses in this city of Philadelphia are worth more than all the wretched slaves which cover the rice swamps of South Carolina. Luther Martin of Maryland followed. He declared the slave trade inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution and dishonorable to the American character. John Rutledge responded immediately. He argued to exclude religion and humanity altogether from this debate. Interest alone is the governing principle with nations, the true question. Rutledge warned, the true question, Rutledge warned, was whether the Southern states would stay in the Union or not. And when it came down to votes, anti-slavery rhetoric accomplished little. Most delegates were perfectly willing to compromise with slaveholders so that the Union could survive. The Constitution ultimately ratified during 1788 offered a multitude of protections for slaveholders. Through the 3/5 clause, slaveholders were guaranteed disproportional representation as lawmakers, and their right to import enslaved Africans could not be reconsidered for another 20 years. The Constitution obligated the federal government to deploy military force against slave insurrections and obliged the non-slaveholding states to return fugitive slaves to their masters. Despite the rhetoric of anti-slavery that had been so compelling during the Revolution and voiced with such passion during the debates at the convention, North American slaveholders had never been in a stronger position. The South Carolinians had repeatedly threatened to withdraw from the Union if their property and slaves were not protected. And while anti-slavery delegates strongly disagreed, they could not thwart South Carolinian resolve. On the eve of the Haitian Revolution, slaveholders from Jamaica and South Carolina had played critical roles in obstructing the political impact of anti-slavery opinion. Jamaica's long-established lobbying network had been effective, and the propaganda efforts of Stephen Fuller had laid the foundation for pro-slavery argument. In Philadelphia, when anti-slavery clashed with the desire to create a stronger union, anti-slavery lost. And during the First Federal Congress of 1790, one lonely petition from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, albeit signed by Benjamin Franklin, was fiercely contested by the representatives from South Carolina. William Smith warned his fellow congressmen that they played with the fire of insurrection if they discussed the petition any further. Congressional leaders attempted to establish a gag rule to blunt the discussion of slavery. And while their efforts failed, sharp lines of division on the question of slavery were now quite clear. In August 1791, slave rebels in French Saint-Domingue began the most radical revolution in the history of the Atlantic world. These men and women, most of them African-born, saw that the revolution in France had wrought political divisions among their oppressors, and they rose up to break their chains. The Assembly of Saint-Domingue quickly realized the enormity of the insurrection and called upon neighboring powers to come to their aid. In a letter to Governor Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, the Assembly claimed that more than 160,000 slaves had risen in revolt, killed more than 600 whites, and reduced to ashes some 300 plantations. The terrified members of the Assembly blamed philosophy for their plight. Pinckney responded, "When we recollect how nearly similar the situation of the southern states and San Domingo are in the possession of slaves, we cannot but sensibly feel for your situation." The South Carolina legislature agreed unanimously to extend a loan of £3,000 to their French counterparts. In New York, the administration of George Washington advanced the French colonists another loan, drawn from the war debt owed to France. In Jamaica, less than a day's sail from Hispaniola, the plea from Saint-Domingue sparked disagreement between wealthy planters such as Brian Edwards, who favored a loan of £100,000, and the majority of white Jamaicans, principally concerned with their own self-preservation. Ultimately, the Jamaica Assembly sent only a few ships with provisions. News of the great insurrection traveled along less formal channels with the scores of terrified migrants who fled the violence and found a refuge in every Atlantic port. In Jamaica, the slaves sang songs about the blacks of Santo Domingo, who signified the latent power black slaves possessed. News traveled more slowly to South Carolina, and while enslaved Carolinians surely knew about the rebellion, there is little evidence that they acted upon these events before 1793. For its most rebellious contemporaries, the Haitian Revolution established a precedent to be followed, and for at least the next 100 years, the Haitian Revolution inspired the Black peoples of the Americas with an example of slavery overthrown. Black radicals in Jamaica responded to the insurrection in Saint-Domingue almost instantly. They advanced conspiracies that were probably long established, but perhaps inevitably, the planters learned of them. In November 1791, Lieutenant Governor Adam Williamson reported that every parish vestry in the island had organized a committee of secrecy and safety to investigate conspiracies, and that each vestry had requested additional arms for their militias. Colonial Council of War met on November 30th and declared martial law to begin on December 10th, well before the onset of the Christmas holiday, when whites expected rebellions from the slaves. The reports of the committees of secrecy and safety from St. James, St. Anne, and Trelawney demonstrate a widespread conspiracy among the slaves in western Jamaica. Sugar planters had developed these parishes fairly recently, over the past 30 years, and the western port of Montego Bay had only recently become a major destination for transatlantic slavers. Situated along an important shipping lane that went past French Saint-Domingue and out into the Atlantic, Montego Bay had become a cosmopolitan port town saturated with news. This is where Philip, a Spanish-speaking black, was caught buying unusually large amounts of gunpowder. According to Philip's own testimony, he had bought the powder on behalf of Jack, a slave hired out to a Jewish merchant named Gobe. Jack worked as a peddler. He had an arrangement with Gobe by which Jack would carry merchandise to the plantations and their slave villages, sell the wares, and keep an eighth of the profits for himself. The committee suspected that Jack had been distributing gunpowder throughout the countryside for several weeks. A Coromantee slave named Duncan testified that he had learned from a slave named Guy that the Negroes to windward say San Domingo had risen and killed the Bacras, meaning the whites, and taken the country. Duncan acknowledged that he planned to join the insurrection, which had been set to begin during the Christmas holiday. The slaves of Westmoreland were to rise first, followed by those in St. James, and if the Maroons joined them, nothing would have saved the whites. The committee heard a report that a black man from St. Mary had bought 3 dozen cutlasses at a store in St. Anne, and that several enslaved blacksmiths had been observed making cutlasses. One Mr. Hudson, a white carpenter, found evidence on Fairfax estate that pistol balls had been made during his absence. A young girl enslaved on Scarlet Hall estate, upon being whipped, said, "Very well, no more than 2 weeks for you." And this was 2 weeks before Christmas. But white Jamaicans were ready. Lieutenant Governor Williamson had at his command a garrison of about 1,800 regular troops. He responded quickly to the parish vestries with a distribution of 7,000 stand of arms with ammunition. He sent detachments of regulars, 30 men under an officer, by warship to Savannah Lamar, Montego Bay, Aracabessa, and Morant Bay. And these are all ports around the island. And he sent a 5th detachment to march from Spanish Town, the capital, into Clarendon, a heavily populated sugar parish. Williamson still had at his disposal more than 1,600 troops permanently stationed in Kingston and Spanish Town. Moreover, martial law required every free man from the age of 15 to 60 to report with arms to militia duty. More than 8,000 free Jamaicans mustered in the parish seats throughout the island during the Christmas season of 1791. They stayed in the local taverns of these little towns for about a month. And in the opinion of one Portland planter, this amassing of white men served to show our strength to the slaves in the face of threats from abroad. The display of white power during the Christmas holidays of 1791 had the intended effect. The slaves did not rise. But it had been a terrifying time for Jamaican whites. In November 1791, as rumors of conspiracy swirled, Stephen Fuller sent an anxious petition from the Assembly to the king. The French in Saint-Domingue, they pleaded, now suffered from the dreadful effects of abolitionism, and Jamaican slaves had the precedent of the triumph of savage anarchy. The Assembly asked for 300 additional troops and a regiment of cavalry. But the Assembly also wanted the king to stop the discussion of the slave trade in Parliament. They rightly observed that abolitionist oratory often condemns slavery as well as the slave trade, and they feared the slaves would be inspired to revolt. It was this historical conjuncture, when slave rebellion and abolitionist agitation threatened simultaneously, that would redefine the politics of Atlantic slavery for a new era. While blacks conspired and whites panicked in Jamaica, white Carolinians celebrated the revolution in France, and black Carolinians bided their time. Governor Pinckney did forward his correspondence with Saint-Domingue to the State Assembly and called for stronger militia and patrol laws to check any rebellious movements among the slaves. But white Carolinians were far more impressed by the French Revolution than by the insurrection in Saint-Domingue. Many saw the events in France as a transatlantic second chapter in the revolution they had begun in 1776. And despite the Assembly of Saint-Domingue's condemnation of philosophy, the Charleston City Gazette printed the entire text of Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. "What we now see in the world," wrote Paine, "from the revolutions of America and France, are a renovation of the natural order of things." When Citizen Edmund Guenet visited the United States in 1793 as a representative of the National Assembly of France, he arrived first in Charleston, where he was widely celebrated. White Carolinians felt so secure in their slaveholding that they could still celebrate the radicalism of the age. But in the summer of 1793, a convergence of developments made white Carolinians deeply concerned that revolution might threaten slavery. In June, in Saint-Domingue, the illustrious city of Cap Français burned to the ground, and the civil commissioner, Léger Félicité Sonthonax, declared the immediate abolition of slavery. As the city burned, hundreds of refugees, white and black, fled the island, and many arrived in Charleston with terrifying tales of insurrection and mayhem. Contemporary estimates range from 300 to 600 white refugees and just as many black people, whose legal status, slave or free, had become uncertain. Charlestonians welcomed the refugees and raised significant amounts of money for their support. But on August 24th, 1793, Governor William Moultrie received letters from the Lieutenant Governor James Wood of Virginia that warned of a conspiracy among the enslaved that stretched from Richmond to Charleston. Authorities in Yorktown, Virginia, had found a letter which they believed to have been misplaced by one Gawan, a black preacher who had passed through town on the way to Norfolk. The letter was addressed to the secret keeper of Norfolk from the secret keeper of Richmond. The letter told of a conspiracy long planned. They had collected 500 guns and heard from our friend in Charleston that 6,000 men were organized and a source of powder found. The killing would begin when they heard again from Charleston. Thomas Newton, a militia commander from Norfolk, wrote that 200 blacks from Cap Français, then residing in Norfolk, compounded the threat of insurrection. 2 days after receiving these letters, Governor Moultrie of South Carolina placed the militia on alert and ordered regular patrols throughout the Charleston district to suppress every large meeting of blacks. Patrol leaders were ordered to be vigilant and to search the slaves' quarters for arms and ammunition. In early October, 2 more ships arrived from Saint-Domingue, carrying refugees, black and white, from Cap Français. Concerned white citizens called a public meeting to discuss the refugees, and in their published resolutions, requested that Governor Moultrie keep the ships under the guns of Fort Johnson until the committee itself had interviewed the passengers to account for their political views. Most importantly, on no account should any black person, regardless of status, be allowed to land in any part of South Carolina. When the governor arrived at his office on the morning of October 10th, A letter signed "A Black" had been left for him. The writer claimed to be in the secret, but uneasy with the bloodshed that others planned. He warned the governor that there were enemies to the northward as well, and that he should not be concerned with Frenchmen alone. Military readiness should be maintained till after the 10th of January at least. A free black, the writer feared for his own life lest he be caught as an informer. And while he acknowledged the scorn so many Charlestonians felt toward him, he expressed a love for a people among whom I have been all my life. A week later, Governor Moultrie issued an order commanding all free Negroes and persons of color who have arrived within 12 months from any other place to depart the state within 10 days. And in November, the city of Charleston banned the assembly of any more than 7 male slaves, with the exception of funerals. White Carolinians were very capable of defending their world. In September 1802, when rumors spread that a French ship carrying incendiaries had been sighted, 500 militiamen mobilized under Brigadier General Peter Horry and marched to the coast. Heightened resistance among the slaves and the powerful white reaction were very real developments in the aftermath of Haiti. And as in Jamaica, the slaves of South Carolina did not rebel. Despite the rise of abolitionism, and despite the Haitian Revolution, the slaveholders of Jamaica and South Carolina had every confidence that their property and human beings remained secure. This can be seen in the economic expansion of both regions. British merchants trading with Jamaica invested in the transatlantic slave trade like never before. During the 5-year period beginning in 1790, an average of 18,000 captive Africans entered Jamaican ports every year. This was an annual increase of 10,000 people from the 5 years before 1790. Newly enslaved Africans provided labor for a significant expansion of Jamaican sugar production, as well as the development of a new staple crop, coffee. As war destroyed their neighbors in French Saint-Domingue, Jamaican planters established 63 additional sugar plantations and 81 new coffee estates. By 1807, Jamaica produced more than half of Britain's sugar. And while coffee remained secondary, Jamaica's crop of 1814 accounted for 30% of global exports. The most powerful Carolinians of the Low Country were far less enthusiastic about importing Africans than their Jamaican counterparts. Despite their forceful defense at the Constitutional Convention of the right to import slaves, Low Country planters were satisfied with the number of slaves they owned and fearful of importing Africans because of the turmoil caused by Haiti. In the backcountry, however, the development of short staple cotton created a new class of aspiring slaveholders who demanded that the transatlantic slave trade be reopened. In 1793, South Carolina planters produced less than 100,000 pounds of cotton. But with the development of the cotton gin, this number soared to 8 million pounds by 1801, just 8 years later. And yet, a vote in the General Assembly to reopen the transatlantic slave trade in 1802 failed by a vote of 86 to 11. Things changed the very next year with the Louisiana Purchase. The victories of Toussaint Louverture's Haitian army had foiled Napoleon's vision for a renewed American empire, enabling the Jefferson administration to maneuver for the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. 3 weeks after Carolinians learned of the purchase, Governor James Richardson called upon the General Assembly of the state to reopen the transatlantic slave trade. And on December 6, 1803, the state Senate voted 55 to 46 to reopen the transatlantic slave trade. The new law continued to prohibit the entrance of all Black people from the Caribbean, especially those who had ever resided in the French West Indies. But captive Africans from the Old World could again be brought to the docks of Charleston and there be sold. South Carolina's political leaders recognized that the expansion of slavery benefited their long-term political interests. Because of the 3/5 clause, Carolinians understood that more African slaves meant more slaveholders, more slaveholding states, and greater influence in the federal government. And perhaps because insurrection had not spread northward from the Caribbean, they felt secure enough in the forceful measures they had made to take a calculated risk. From 1804 to 1808, when the slave trade closed, South Carolinians imported almost 47,000 captive Africans, more than any other 4-year period in South Carolina's history. While some of these people were marched to the upcountry cotton regions, a substantial number were brought straight to Louisiana. The emergence of political abolitionism and the existential threat posed by the Haitian Revolution fostered distinct evolutions in the political economies of slavery in Jamaica and South Carolina. Anti-slavery emerged as a political force in Great Britain and the United States at the same moment in time. But while South Carolinians could now defend their interests against their anti-slavery peers as equals, Jamaicans continued to depend upon the old imperial lobbying system. South Carolina possessed equal representation with its partner states in the federal government. In contrast, their Jamaican counterparts depended upon intermediaries. Stephen Fuller did thwart anti-slavery action in 1788, but his political position was no stronger with this victory, and he could not inhibit the growth of anti-slavery sentiment. Carolinians not only guaranteed their right to import captive Africans for another 20 years, they also assured the incommensurate power for slaveholders as a political class through the 3/5 clause. The relative strength of American slaveholders was not immediately apparent. The old West Indian lobbying system worked quite well, securing more troops and a delay to anti-slavery agitation that must have seemed permanent to those who continued to invest in the slave economy. But in 1807, political anti-slavery achieved the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade throughout the Anglophone Atlantic. Slave trade abolition was a defeat for slaveholders in both places, but the Jamaicans would never recover, while the Carolinians would. The difference in these apparently similar measures lay in the impact of abolitionist accomplishment. In the United States, slave trade abolition was the resolution of a constitutional compromise. Lower South representatives voted against the ban, and though defeated, they hardly faced and ascended abolitionism. White Jamaicans did. Slave trade abolition represented for thousands of Britons a national moral accomplishment, and the West Indian interest was powerless to change this belief. British abolitionism became more radical and powerful, while American abolitionism remained comparatively quiet, marginalized by the political power of the slaveholding states. The slaveholders of Jamaica and South Carolina reconsolidated power at the turn of the 18th century, but the structural differences in their politics made their paths diverge sharply in the decades that followed. These planter classes stood in distinct moments of historical time. While South Carolinians pioneered the making of a second slavery in the United States, Jamaicans oversaw the demise of the first colonial slavery in the British Caribbean. Led by South Carolinians, American slaveholders marginalized the abolitionists and suppressed conspiring slaves. National cotton production increased enormously. A sugar industry developed along the lower Mississippi Valley. Rice production continued apace, and the interstate slave trade that fueled this economic expansion destroyed thousands of Black lives. The limited geography of Britain's Caribbean colonies would not have supported the same magnitude of expansion as the American South. But if not for the weakening political position of Jamaican slaveholders, who had led the West Indian interest for a century, enslavement would no doubt have persisted much longer in the British Caribbean. West Indian slaveholders could not suppress the abolitionists in the metropole, nor could they stem the influence of liberating ideas that emboldened men and women who had always rebelled. Slavery in the British Caribbean survived the abolition of the slave trade for only one more generation. In terrible contrast, slavery in the United States expanded at the base of the most lucrative branch of American commercial agriculture. It was the lethal reality for 3 more generations of African Americans, and it would only be destroyed by a brutal civil war.